Hi, my name's Annie and I run a sewing school in Cornwall. We've been plunged into the middle of a completely extraordinary time where we can't go to the places that we want to go to, and a lot of our hobbies have been taken away from us. And not only that, but we can't see our nearest and dearest. But I've been really pleased to hear of positive thinking when it comes to garden parties and street parties and massive get-togethers when all of this is over, and it will be over at some point. So while everyone is at home, I thought that I would have a little initiative to get everybody who wanted to have something to do with their sewing machine to make some bunting, so that when we do all these big street parties, we have the wherewithal to decorate and celebrate getting through this really dark time. Now, I teach bunting as a session on my beginner's course, and so it's a relatively easy thing for me to do. So I'm putting together this little video to help anybody who knows how to sew forwards and backwards on their sewing machine but doesn't know much else, to give you a quick glimpse into how a string of bunting is a relatively easy thing to put together, so that at the end of this all we have lots of lovely flags and decorations to be able to help celebrate when we are allowed to come back together as a community. So the template is downloadable from my website and will also be in the files section of my Facebook page. The first thing you want to do is cut out your flags. The arrowed line denotes the grain. So if you're really new to sewing, that probably won't mean anything to you. But at a very quick intro, the grain line is basically the threads running through the fabric, either in a horizontal or vertical direction. Now, I've got striped fabric, and the stripes are running down the length of my fabric, and they will run down the length of my bunting, so I just need to line up the arrow with the stripes, because I know that the stripes are on the grain. If you want to find out the grain, if you look at the back of your fabric, you'll be able to see the threads running in two directions. As long as the arrow is parallel with one of those threads, one of those directions, that's absolutely fine. So pop your flag onto your fabric and pin it on. If you're going to use a pair of scissors or a rotary cutter, you need still to pin it on. You will see, have layered up two fabrics on top of each other because you can cut two flags at once, and that will save you some time. You need two flags per, two triangle shapes per finished flag in your bunting. So I'm just going to snip around. If your fabric has no directional pattern, like these stripes are not directional, or a pattern that you don't mind if it goes in a different direction, you can then just lay your triangle next to the triangle that you've just cut in order to minimise wastage, and cut round again. Now, I haven't pinned this second time because I'm doing this as hastily as I possibly can in this video, largely because my 5-year-old is sitting behind the camera. It's just like everybody else, we're all trying to work with our children at home while the toddler has a nap. Okay, so I've cut out 3 sets of fabric for my flags. I'm going to take the template off, and what we're going to do now is stitch the triangles together. So your fabric has a printed side and a non-printed side. The printed side is called the right side, and the back of the fabric is called the wrong side. Technically, that's sewing tech for people that are new to this. all of my other students and other sewists who are watching this will know how that goes. So I'm going to place my flags right sides together, which is the side of the fabric that you ultimately want facing outwards. You're going to start stitching it facing inwards, and I'm going to pin just along the two long edges. Now I put my pins in at a right angle to the edge because it allows you, if you're in a hurry, to sew straight over the top of them, which I'll show you in a second when I do the stitching, but not everybody likes to do that. So it's up to you how you pin them together. Some people use quilter's clips. All right, so do that with all of your flags, pin them all together, and then we're going to stitch them. So I've placed my fabric inside into my machine, put the presser foot down, and on the base plate of your machine you will have a number of different lines that are distance guides from the stitch line. So we're going with the 10 mark, which is 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter. The distance between the outside edge of the flag and the stitch line is called the seam allowance, and that means that we have a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Pop your needle down. We're going to go forward a little bit, 3 or 4 stitches, and then you're going to go backwards a little bit. Every single new modern machine has the ability to go backwards. It's called back tacking. And we back tack at the beginning and end of every seam in order to secure the stitching and to make sure that it doesn't come out. Don't pull your fabric through the machine. The machine should propel the fabric through. I'm only helping it a little bit where the pins are. When you get to the point at the bottom, pop your needle down, lift the foot up, and then pivot around. That means you have a continuous line of stitching and a nice sharp point. Once you've done that, put the foot back down and carry on going. I'm just going to take that pin out. I'm not religiously sticking to the seam allowance because I'm just racing this through so that we can get this video made. When you get to the other end, back tack again, and then trim your threads and take your flag to the ironing board. So once you've stitched your flag, there are a number of things you're going to do before you turn it through. The first thing you're going to do is trim any excess threads off from the start and end of your stitching. At the bottom where you have the point, you're going to trim that triangle off. Don't cut right up to the stitching. You need to be about 2 millimeters below where you stitched, but take that little point off. And then you're going to grade away, what we call grading away with the scissors, to just reduce the seam allowance a bit as it goes down into the point. The reason that we do that is because when we turn this through, all of this fabric here has to fit inside that tiny little gap. And if you want to have a nice sharp point, you need to really reduce the amount of fabric that's going into that gap. Once you've done that, you can turn your flag through. Use a bluntish pencil or the ends of your scissors to push the point through. You can see that my pencil is not as blunt as I thought it was. So that you have a flag. Now, anybody who's been to any of my classes know how important I feel having an iron is when you own a sewing machine, and this is one of the times where it comes into its own. And if you have a sewing machine and it's out, then your iron and your ironing board should also be out. We're just going to roll the seams away from each other a little bit. Now the reason that we do that is especially up here is because if you just pressed it as it was, you'd be liable to press all of this bit of fabric into a crease, which would mean that your flags are all different shapes and sizes. So what you really want to do is press it so that your seams are as rolled out as they possibly can be, and you haven't got any fabric hidden inside a crease. Give it a quick press with a bit of steam to put it into place. can always roll as you go. And there you can see that you've got a lovely double-sided bunting flag. Just trim off any unevenness at the top, and specifically these two little triangular bits that poke up once you've turned it through. And then we're going to put it inside some bias binding. So we're going to use bias binding to string all of our bunting flags together. Bias binding comes on the roll. You can buy it very cheaply on eBay, and if you're making meters and meters of bunting, it is the cheapest way to buy it, is in wholesale quantities on eBay. I think, I can't remember exactly, but I think a massive roll of about 50 meters is about £6 or £7. This is just plain white bias binding. So you fold the binding in half, and then use your finger to just run a crease down the centre of the binding. This will mean that when you stitch from the top, your stitching is replicated on the back, and you're capturing all layers in the one stitch line, which will make a lot of sense when we go back to the machine and stitch it on. Fold your bias binding in half like that, and then place your flag inside the bias strip. Fold it back over the top so that you've made a nice little sandwich there. And I would pin at each corner very securely. You just need a pin in each corner. Don't just put one or two in the middle section. The corners are actually the most important bit. And when you pin, try and make sure that you go through all of the binding and all of the layers underneath, as I've done. And then one in the middle just to secure it. You will have made, I hope, many flags. So you might have a question. Here's a sample that I use in my classes. You might have a question about distancing of flags. Now, I like to have at least a 2-inch gap between the flags, but you can have longer. And if you're making long lengths of bunting, you could have a whole flag's width between flags and still have a really lovely effect. I'm just going to pop this flag in here so that you can see that the main thing to do when you're making a long string of bunting is to string all of your flags together, pin them all together in one long length, or as long a length as you feel you can handle, because you will get a neater finish along the top if you're stitching in one long continuous line. So I've pinned my 2 flags into the bias strip, and then I'm going to go back to the sewing machine to finish it off. So when you sew your flags into your strip, the neatest finish is to use a straight stitch about 3mm, 2 or 3mm away from the edge of your bias binding, as you can see I'm doing here. I'm stitching in grey because I want you to be able to see it, but ideally you would be stitching in the same colour as the binding that you are using, and binding comes in all sorts of different colours. I have some yellow that I sometimes use in my classes. So I'm just stitching. Be very careful over the corners because you really want to capture them in. And if I take these pins out here, you can see that the stitching is the same on the back as it is on the front, and that's because we creased neatly down the centre of the bias binding before we put the flag in. If you are worried about this level of precision of sewing and capturing all levels together, you can put your machine onto a large zigzag stitch. Now I'm just altering the settings on my machine because I have the ability to alter both stitch length and stitch width, but not everybody has that, and some people have machines just with presets on. So you just need a big zigger, and that will do the job just as well. And you can see the thing about the zigger stitch is that you have a lot less requirement to be precise because the stitches are covering a wider area. And if you're stitching in the same colour as the bias binding that you're stitching into, then it it won't be visible anyway. One last word on the Zigglering. The thing about Zigglering is that you use 2 or 3 times as much thread as you would otherwise use, so just be warned, it is quite thread hungry, and if you want to conserve your thread supplies, a straight stitch is definitely the better one to use. So that is how you make a string of bunting. I hope that this has given you something that you can focus on your stitching skills or get interested in stitching as we all find our way through this weird time, and I really look forward to seeing photos of all of your finished bunting when we are in mass celebration mode, when this is all over and we're allowed out again. The other good thing about bunting is that it's a super scrap busting activity, so you can use any bits of leftover fabric from your dressmaking or anything else that you might be stitching up while we're all in isolation to reduce waste and recycle old duvet covers and things that you might have lying about. I will be running some of my some of my sewing classes online during this strange period, so if you're interested in taking up a new skill whilst you are holed up indoors, then please do follow me on Facebook or send me an email and I can put you on my mailing list, and I will be trying to do more of these quick free activities for people, and especially teens and children, since I'm at home with 2 small people. I'm sure we all need activities to keep them occupied, but anyway, let me know if this has been useful, and if you've made anything, I'd be really interested to connect with you and find out how you're doing. Thanks very much.